On the surface, Douglas Murray's recent bestseller, The Strange Death of Europe, was a reaction to the migrant crisis of 2015, where he spent months at Europe's borders interviewing migrants, natives, and policymakers. But in it, he argues that the migrant crisis and Europeans' reaction to it is another symptom of a broader spiritual crisis, a crisis of meaning, and a sense that the story has run out at a fundamental level.
Well, The Strange Death of Europe was in part a response to the migration crisis of 2015 onwards, which I saw up close, and it was an attempt by me to meditate on what I thought was going on through reporting, a sort of real-time history writing, and also some philosophizing about the deeper reasons why it was going on. I wanted to take the opportunity to not just describe events, but describe why those events might be happening, and to take a step back from what was front page news every day, and to saying why was it happening. And I thought that there were, broadly speaking, two components. One was the world appearing to want to come to Europe, and the other was what had happened in Europe that meant that this was the case. What was it about us that meant, for good and ill, that that was going to be allowed and possible? And I wanted to try to address those deeper tones, because I thought they were everywhere. You couldn't stand at borders of various European countries and not think of history all the time. There is something about Europe, because we've been a crucible of considerable amount of civilization for a very long time now, that means that every, or a lot of places positively hum with history and things that have been extraordinary and great, and things that have been worse than anything that anyone ever came up with. So.
And you draw a link in that book between a sort of religious crisis in Europe, that we've lost our values, and immigration, which is something that
people don't like.
People don't like.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Could you explain how those pieces do link together?
Well, broadly speaking, because we like to think that everybody in the world is like us, which among other things is somewhat presumptuous. And from a lot of travel in a lot of places over a lot of years now, I've come to the conclusion that there are an enormous number of things that unite people across the whole world, but there's an awful lot of difference as well. And it isn't just the case that we're all after the same things, or we all believe the same things. It's not the case that we all have the same views, or could have the same views, or should have the same views. And it's not obvious at all to me that if you walk into another continent, even if you become a citizen, that you inevitably become as much of that continent as anyone else who's ever been there. And it seems to me that numbers matter and that speed matters. And there are a whole set of very obvious demonstrations of that. And I don't blame individual migrants or groups of migrants for that, but if we were to transplant an entire Welsh mining village to Kashmir, you would not expect that village to become Kashmiri overnight, or even in generations possibly. They'd most likely retain a lot of their own customs and a lot of their own views and their own music, even. And yet we pretend that the opposite in reverse is not very interesting, not going to have any implications, and not have any consequences. It's all going to keep going on. I just don't think it will. I think it's very obvious that it won't. I think there's a massive amount of evidence, only some of which I put in the book, that says it'll just be very different. And a lot of people say it'll be very different, great. Some people say it'll be very different, that's a problem. But I have very little respect or time for people who think It's just all going to keep being the same. There'll be good things and there'll be bad things. I'm very willing to talk about both, but if everyone else only talks about the good, I can't help myself from talking about some of the bad.
It feels like a lot of people are feeling the same sort of disconnect at the moment. What do you make of that?
Yes, I mean, I think that the disconnect, you point to the disconnect I've tried to write about, is when people become aware that they are coming apart from the source of what got them to where they are, or to put it another way, that you become aware that you're soaring off the branch of the tree that you're sitting on. Doesn't necessarily mean it's fatal, but it's an instinct that a lot of people have, and I think has been going on for a very long time. I mean, more than a century. And yes, I've tried to write about it because I think it's something that doesn't get written about very much. I said somewhere that we're living in an era where maybe one of the first times in human history, or certainly one of the first times we know of, where there is no overarching explanation for what we're doing. And that's a big thing to miss. It's a big thing to ignore. And maybe it's inevitable that people wouldn't spend much time thinking about it publicly, because there's an awful lot of questions that come in the wake of that one.
And I think you've said something like this before, that some of the criticisms of Strange Death of Europe focused on the immigration issue, sure, but very few of them focused on your central point.
Yes. In a way, it was a disappointment to me when his book came out, that I was just very struck. There are basically two major issues in the book. One is, I mean, to sort of make it crude, one is about them, as it were, people coming in to Western societies, and the other is the us, as it were, what is the Western society already. And I was just very struck that such criticism as there was focused solely on the first part of that, and that slightly disappointed me. In fact, it greatly disappointed me, because it suggested that the second part, the diagnosis of the liberal West's current situation, may well be right, or even more right than I thought, because nobody had even bothered to counter it. I mean, there are various reasons why that might be the case. The most charitable would be that people would rather deal with what they think of as being the more inflammatory issue. Not that I think either issue is particularly inflammatory, but that you go for the most difficult part, as they would see it. And I think they're wrong on that, because I think the immigration bit isn't the difficult part of it. I think the difficult part of it is the us bit, is what do we expect of ourselves, let alone what do we expect of people who come. And yes, I'm just amazed that almost nobody has bothered to take any of that on. It's about half the book is a meditation on us, why we are where we are.
Did you in some sense want them to refute that and
Yes.
show that you were wrong?
Yes, very much. I'm very open for somebody coming along and saying your apparent pessimism about our present condition, Murray, is wildly misguided. Let me tell you why. I love that.
You prefer the book to be wrong?
Sure. I've no particular desire for the worst things I diagnose and worry about coming to be. I mean, I think there are some people who are so incredibly narcissistic that they would rather the world went to hell as they predicted than that they would prove wrong along the way. As I say, I'd be very happy if there were a philosophical refutation of what I say about the exhaustion of modern European, in particular, mankind, but I haven't seen it. I don't doubt it's possible, but I'd love to see it come along. But there may be another reason for that, which is that again, we've got into a habit of, certainly in public discussion, of talking about the hamster wheel, because it's endlessly diverting. noisy, fun, raucous, sexy, terrible, hilarious, tragic, within any 24-hour cycle. So it's understandable that we might get stuck on it. And to an extent, the first bit of what I describe in Strange Death of Europe is a bit of that, not all of that by any means, but a bit of that. And the harder thing is to press pause and say, well, where are we? And engage in that discussion, just because there's so much to distract us from having that discussion. You have to do a whole lot of things mentally that we're not currently very good at preparing ourselves for, to step off the hamster wheel, attractive as it is, and try to address the cantus firmus.
I know quite a lot of people who are in sort of various progressive networks, developmental networks, looking at, very open to this idea that what we are seeing is in some sense a kind of spiritual or theological crisis, that we've lost our moorings, we don't know where we are, and they're very open to the idea, for example, of seeing climate change as a manifestation of this kind of loss of a sense of the sacred.
Yes.
Much less so open to the idea that Europe in some sense is committing suicide through this loss of the sacred.
Well, several things. Firstly, I don't ever go along really with the term progressive. I think it makes several massive errors. One is, a lot of people like to call themselves progressives, and I was once told years ago by a philosopher that you should never use a term or never use a sentence even, the opposite of which would only be used by a madman. Unless there were a very large movement of people boasting about being regressive, the use of the word progressive is it's an uncountered form of halo polishing, self-halo polishing. I'm a progressive. Oh, nice. What a nice person you must be. Not like those awful self-confessed regressives over there. So I think it doesn't work on a definitional sense. It also doesn't work, it pushes this teleological version of history where we're always surging forward to more and more rights and more improvement and so on. And I know why there's an attraction to that. I just think it's something which, even if it's so deeply embedded in the hardware now of people in societies like ours, should be pushed back against at least a bit. Of course you can say that things progress, but you also have to put great big buts in along the way. It's like that great argument over whether or not the 20th century constituted progress, and you show all the ways in which it did, but you've got two great big buts in the form of the two world wars, and those are massive buts. And I can think of smaller examples of the same today. So the first thing is that it may be that progressives are dreaming and living a dream that's not itself based on very much other than some kind of optimistic high. So I'd say that first. But the other thing is that there seems to me just to be and perhaps it's in what you term the progressive mindset especially, but an unwillingness to follow ideas to their conclusions. What is one of the most popularly heard things of our day, but I find that offensive, or you can't say that. Very rarely that's untrue. Very rarely. I always find an enormous relief when somebody says that's untrue, and let me tell you why. But it's quite rare, that much more common to say that's offensive, which is of course often the case, but then a lot of the facts of life are very offensive. Almost everything in life is offensive or has a capacity to offend. So it's not a great way to pursue truth, but then you have to think, well, is even pursuing truth a very popular past time these days, and I'm not sure it is. So, for all of those reasons, people don't particularly want to. The fact that people don't particularly want to see things, don't particularly want to face up to things, is absolutely no useful criteria for whether or not the things which they don't want to face up to are true or not. In fact, it may be quite the opposite. The things they don't wish to face up to, the things they don't wish to admit to, are probably the things most likely to be true. I mean, the whole of life is set up in a sense, in this fashion, isn't it? Death is a pretty offensive thing.
And a writer I know that you also admire, Paul Berman, talks about this rationalist naivety, this sort of sense of it's very difficult for late 20th century, early 21st century people to conceive that it's possible for people not to share their views at some fundamental level, that we're all the same in some...
Yes.
And that, to me, sort of cuts to some of the core of this idea that the very concept that people may be telling the truth when they say that they are motivated by religious texts, for example. A lot of people feel very resistant to that idea.
Yeah. Well, I think Paul Berman, who I have enormous admiration for, I don't think he's been remotely as widely recognized as he should have been. But after 9/11, yes, in the first of his major post-9/11 books, Terror and Liberalism, which made a big splash at the time, in 2003 or so, wasn't it? It came out. Berman had been reading a lot of the Islamist texts, which I suppose he wouldn't have read if it hadn't been for 9/11. Of course, now you have a generation going up to university, I think this year, who would have who were born after 9/11, just about there. So we're talking about quite far away history now, aren't we? But at that time, when people really didn't know anything much about the Islamic world, unless they were specialists in it, there was a big learning curve, fast learning curve. Paul Berman was one of those who threw himself right into it, and not that he hadn't thought widely about the nature of Western liberalism before, but he was looking into what this other thing that seemed to have challenged it might be. And yes, his readings of Said Qutb and others, I think, was a very useful way to demonstrate to his readers as well as to himself that here was a fundamentally different way of viewing absolutely everything. I mean, here's the thing that's so hard to realize unless the thing smashes through your window, that metaphorically or literally, that there are entirely other ways of viewing not just what we should do today and how we should arrange our diaries, but everything from the most basic acts of ablution, diet, consumption, behavior, manners, mores, all the way through to the meaning of life, love, history, death, afterlife, the universe. Quite a lot is packed in there. And yes, Berman was one of those who said at a crucial moment, look, what we think is obvious isn't obvious to a lot of other people around the world, and it's not obvious that it all goes our way. And that is something I've been very struck by in recent years, is the presumption of, I suppose again what you would call progressives, but the presumption of people that history basically consists of a street up which we're all walking to a glorious place on a hill or something like that.
Where Francis Fukuyama is waiting for us.
With open arms. And that we go up to this high place, and the direction of travel is so obviously attractive, as are all of the things you can accrue along the way, that everybody in time joins us. But history makes a mockery of that, because it shows us time and again counter theories, contrary events. And this isn't to say, by the way, that for instance, Said Qutb or any of his contemporaries are the most extraordinary refutation of what we have in societies like the one we're sitting in right now. I think far from it. I think they're fairly easily refuted if you were to have a level playing field. But at least at the very beginning, the point is simply that Berman and others made is that this is very different.
And also, he did two things in that book that were very clever. One, to say this is very different, and also there are similarities in that this millenarian kind of branch of Islam actually has psychological similarities with the constant. There's always a fight between certainty and liberalism, and it tends to result in violence.
Yes, I have to say I'm slightly more sceptical about some of that bit, because I think there's a tendency to, I mean, Berman is the absolute best of this, but there is a tendency sometimes to read any new historical event, or any event that is new to you, through the prism of what you already know, inevitably. In Britain, we still tend to talk a lot about Northern Ireland when we talk about conflict, and, you know, people around the world do not. In Britain, we tend to. It's because it was what we knew in terms of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, and indeed in conflict. So there's always that tendency. We've all got it. The point is that we all do that to some extent, inevitably. I'm sure I do it. But I think in some ways it's to be resisted. And yes, it's inevitable that people who live in the wake of 20th century European fascism and communism might try to understand all other totalitarian movements, millenarian movements, and others through those lenses. And they do have things in common. I mean, it's sort of inevitable that anybody, once they think they can kill in the righteous cause, has at least a gun in common. But beyond that, I think sometimes people stretch it. I mean, there are some aspects of Islam that make Islam totally unlike anything else. Just as there are aspects of fascism that make fascism totally unlike anything else, and that isn't to diminish observations you can make and linkages you can make. I just think that to some extent it's more comforting to us, strangely, isn't it? It's more comforting to us to think we understand a new thing that comes along, when in actual fact we may be able to understand like the tiniest corner of the tablecloth of it.
And you link a possible reason for this to colonial guilt.
Mm-hmm.
But then
guilt in general.
But then you also talk about Sweden. And Sweden looks like it's possible that native Swedes will be a minority in their own country in the lifetime of people living now. And Sweden had no colonies to speak of.
Well, I don't think it's only colonialism. I say that, as you point out, Sweden was not a colonial power. Britain was. Germany did start the Second World War. Britain did not. But we all have been persuaded to share a certain amount of German guilt, it seems to me. You can easily say, and it's happened to me many times in discussions and debates, you know, look what we did in Europe, the Second World War. You can say that in London, you can say that to an audience of Brits, and they can be persuaded that they had some kind of culpability. So there is a spreading round, as I see it, of guilt, which means that the specifics and the details become relatively unimportant. So that Europeans from Thessalonica to Dublin are expected to share similar historical burdens. I don't think, by the way, they should. I don't think it's right. And I certainly don't think it's right doing it, only us doing it, because I think that no peoples in history have ever been blameless. I'm interested in why we fall for the idea here so much, why we are so able to be encouraged into this idea of guilt. I think there's all sorts of religious and post-religious reasons for that. I'm interested in how, if ever, we can get out of that guilt. I cite Nietzsche on this because Nietzsche foresaw some of this when he saw that we might retain the Christian idea of guilt and not have the Christian capability for absolution, which is, I think, the situation we're currently in. Like, how do British people get over colonialism? I actually think most of Britain has. I think this is a sort of rarefied. I think there are various sadists from academia outside who think that they can persuade the British people to feel guilty for the rest of time, and I don't think they'll succeed. I think you can do that much more successfully with the German population, or I suspect that one of the things we're already seeing, and we're going to see a lot more in the years ahead, is young Germans saying, "Excuse me, but I didn't do it." And I think we're going to have to take an attitude towards that. We're going to have to be able to evolve our attitudes towards it, and we're going to have some flexibility about it, because apart from anything else, it's not right to tell people that they have to carry the guilt of their great-grandparents, which it'll be in due course. It's not right to tell them that they should be shouldering that till the end of time. It wouldn't be right to do it in the same way it wouldn't be right to find the descendants of Genghis Khan and tell them to pay some kind of moral tax. So it's a problem, this. But I'm not persuaded that it's an honest campaign. I think, as I've often said, there's a problem of masochism in the West, particularly in Europe, which may be a kink we start to lose as we discover that there are people who like to take advantage of it. But that's just one aspect of it, the guilt thing, and I think Angela Merkel may have, by what she did in 2015, started to cure Europe of this. It's like I said in Australia
Conversion therapy.
Yes. The thing of, well, I think we've done that enough might be an instinct that starts to come up more. I already hear it coming up more. I've heard it more and more since my book came out. It was only 18 months ago. I think a lot of the weather has changed. But there's also this problem about memory in general, which is, we know that a reasonable and civilized society ought to remember. The former Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks once said that, Isaiah Berlin was once asked what it meant to be Jewish, and Isaiah Berlin said he thought it meant to have a sense of history. And Rabbi Sacks once said, no, Isaiah was almost right. He said to be Jewish means to have a sense of memory. To take that and make it not just a Jewish thing, which I think it isn't, but I think civilized people have to have a sense of memory. We know in Europe, and we should know. It's not like I'm saying let's forget anything. I'm saying let's also bear in mind what the correct proportions are. What is a sense of history and memory that's not just decent towards the rest of the world, but decent towards ourselves? I think these are questions we have to engage ourselves in, because I think people are engaging them in their day-to-day lives all the time, and they're coming to conclusions of their own unaided.
Douglas Murray, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rebel Wisdom is a new sense-making platform, bringing together the most rebellious and inspiring thinkers from around the world. If you're enjoying our content, then you can help us make more by becoming a subscriber, which will give you access to a load of exclusive films. Also, you can then join our group Zoom calls to discuss the ideas in the films, and you can send us ideas for questions for upcoming interviews. And if you're a regular viewer, you'll know we talk a lot about the value of embodying or actually living out the ideas that we talk about. So that's why we run regular events in London. Check out the links on the website for more. And hope to see you soon.